Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son asked, his voice warm, almost proud, as his arms wrapped around me in the middle of the Christmas party. And for a moment, I smiled the way a mother does when she's trying to hold on to a version of reality that no longer exists. But then I pulled back just enough to look at his face, searching for the hint of a joke, a misunderstanding, anything that would make sense of what he had just said. And quietly, so quietly that I almost didn't recognize my own voice, I replied, "What money, Daniel?" And just like that, the room changed, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the subtle way a warm room turns cold when someone opens a door in the middle of winter. Conversations softened, laughter thinned out, and somewhere behind my son's shoulder, I noticed Vanessa standing perfectly still, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. And I knew, without knowing how, that something had been wrong for a very long time, longer than I had allowed myself to see, because for the past 2 years, I had been living in a small one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, carefully measuring out my days in grocery lists and utility bills, choosing which expenses could wait and which ones couldn't, wearing the same coat through 2 winters because replacing it felt indulgent, telling myself that this was just a temporary phase, that my son was busy building his business, that success required distance, that love didn't always look like weekly visits or long phone calls. And every time I reassured myself, I pushed aside the quiet questions that tried to surface, the ones that whispered, "Why hasn't he asked how you're really doing?" Or, "Why does everything feel so one-sided now?" But standing there in that beautifully decorated living room, surrounded by twinkling lights and expensive ornaments that probably cost more than my monthly rent, I realized those questions had been trying to protect me from this exact moment, because Daniel was still looking at me, confusion slowly replacing the easy confidence in his expression. "Mom, the transfers," he said, lowering his voice slightly as if this were a private conversation, though I could feel the attention of everyone nearby tightening around us. "The 5,000 a month, I've been sending it for almost 2 years now, and I felt something inside me shift, not break, not yet, but shift in a way that made everything suddenly sharper, clearer, like adjusting a pair of glasses you didn't realize were out of focus, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had never received a single dollar, not one check, not one deposit, not one unexplained increase in my balance. Nothing that would suggest the kind of support he was describing, and for a brief second, I wondered if this was some kind of mistake, a banking error, a miscommunication, something technical and impersonal that could be fixed with a phone call. But then I saw Vanessa set her glass down a little too carefully, her fingers lingering on the stem as if she needed the extra second to steady herself. And when she finally looked up, her eyes didn't meet mine. They flickered instead toward Daniel, measuring, calculating. And that was when the confusion began to settle into something else. Something heavier, something colder, because it wasn't just that money was missing. It was that someone had been standing between what was given and what was received, quietly redirecting, quietly deciding, quietly shaping a reality that only one of us was allowed to see. And I thought back to all the little things I had dismissed over the past 2 years. The way Vanessa always insisted on handling paperwork when Daniel was busy, the way she would answer questions before he had the chance, the way certain conversations seemed to end before they fully began, and suddenly those moments didn't feel random anymore. They felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I had been looking at upside down. And as the music continued to play softly in the background, and someone laughed a little too loudly across the room, I realized that this Christmas party, this perfect, glowing evening that was supposed to be about family and celebration, had just become something else entirely, because whatever had been hidden was no longer hidden, not after that one simple question. And I stood there, holding my composure the way I had learned to do over a lifetime of putting others first, and said again, a little more clearly this time, "Daniel, I haven't received anything." And in the silence that followed, I understood that this wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the moment everything finally came into the light. The silence did not last long, but it lingered just enough to reveal what people tried to hide when they believed no one was watching. And I had spent a lifetime watching, not in a suspicious way, but in the quiet, patient way that comes from raising a family, from noticing small changes in tone, in posture, in the way someone avoids a question instead of answering it. And now, standing in that room, I saw everything more clearly than I ever had before. Daniel's brow tightening as he pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving quickly across the screen with the same efficiency he used when running his business. While Vanessa shifted slightly beside him, her shoulders straight, but her eyes unfocused, as if she were already somewhere else, somewhere safer. And I remained still, my hands folded loosely in front of me, because there was nothing for me to reach for. No explanation I could offer that would make sense of something I had never received. And as Daniel began scrolling, I felt my mind drifting back, not to anything dramatic, but to the quiet routines of my everyday life, the kind that no one else ever really sees. The mornings when I would stand in my small kitchen calculating how to stretch a carton of eggs through the week, the afternoons when I would sit by the window with a blanket over my knees, reviewing bills and deciding which ones could wait a few more days, the evenings when I would turn off lights earlier than necessary just to keep the electric bill from climbing too high. And through all of it, I had never once imagined that somewhere, in some account I had never seen, money was supposedly being sent to me. Money that could have changed everything, not in a lavish way, but in the small, meaningful ways that make life feel less heavy, less uncertain. And I realized then that what unsettled me most was not the absence of that money, but the presence of a story that had been told without me, a version of my life that existed in someone else's understanding, one where I was comfortable, supported, taken care of, while in reality I had been quietly adjusting, quietly managing, quietly disappearing from the center of my own family. And Daniel suddenly stopped scrolling, his expression sharpening as if he had found something he did not expect. "Here," he said, turning the screen slightly, not fully toward me, but enough to confirm that what he was seeing was real. Every transfer, same amount, same date, every month. And I nodded once, not because I needed to see it, but because I understood now that this was no longer about whether the money existed, it clearly did, but about where it had gone, and more importantly, who had been guiding it there. And I glanced briefly at Vanessa, not directly, just enough to catch the way her hand tightened around the edge of the table, her nails pressing lightly into the polished surface. And in that small, controlled movement, I saw more truth than any words could have provided, because guilt does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it reveals itself in the effort it takes to remain composed. And I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not yet, but a calm clarity that I had not felt in a long time, as if all the unanswered questions of the past 2 years had finally aligned into something I could no longer ignore. And while the room around us tried to return to its earlier warmth, conversations slowly picking back up, music filling the spaces where silence had been, I knew that nothing about this night was the same anymore. Because once you see the pattern, once the pieces fall into place, you cannot pretend they are still scattered. And I stood there, breathing evenly, allowing the moment to unfold without rushing it. Because whatever came next, it would not be shaped by confusion or doubt. It would be shaped by understanding. And for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer on the outside of my own story. Daniel did not speak right away after showing the transactions, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have, because it meant he was trying to make sense of something that did not fit into the version of reality he had been living in. And I recognized that feeling, the slow, uncomfortable realization that what you believe to be true might not be true at all. And I watched as he scrolled again, more carefully this time, his eyes narrowing slightly, his posture shifting from casual to focused. And then he said, almost to himself, "This does not make sense." And I felt a quiet echo of that statement settle inside me. Because for 2 years, nothing had made sense, not the distance, not the silence, not the way conversations with my son had become shorter and less frequent. And yet I had accepted it. I had explained it away. I had told myself that this was just what life looked like when children grew up and built lives of their own. But now, standing here, I saw that something else had been shaping that distance, something more deliberate. And Daniel turned his head slightly toward Vanessa, not fully confronting her, not yet, but enough to include her in the space of the question he had not asked out loud. And she smiled then, a small, controlled smile that might have looked natural to someone who was not paying attention. But I had spent years reading the difference between genuine warmth and practiced composure, and this was the latter. And she said, in a tone that was almost light, "There has to be some kind of mix-up. Maybe the bank had an issue or the account information was entered incorrectly. And it was a reasonable suggestion, simple, logical, the kind of explanation people reach for when they want to close a situation quickly, but it did not settle anything. Not for me. And judging by the way Daniel's expression remained tense, not for him either. And I noticed how she did not ask to see the account details, did not step forward to help clarify, did not offer to call anyone or check any records. She simply placed the possibility of an error into the room and waited, as if hoping it would be enough to redirect the conversation. And in that moment, I understood something important, that avoidance is not always loud. Sometimes it is presented as helpfulness, as calm reasoning, as an attempt to keep things from becoming complicated. And I felt a strange sense of clarity settle over me, because for the first time, I was not trying to make things easier for everyone else. I was simply observing, and Daniel shook his head slightly. No, I double-checked everything when I set it up. The account information was correct, and I have confirmations for every transfer. And his voice had changed, not raised, not angry, but firmer, more precise, the way it probably sounded in business meetings when something did not add up, and I could see the shift happening inside him. The movement from assumption to investigation, and Vanessa's fingers tapped lightly against the table, once, then stilled, and she said nothing more, and that silence, her silence, spoke louder than any explanation she might have given. And I realized then that this was not going to resolve itself in a single conversation, not here, not tonight, because what had been hidden had taken time to build, and it would take time to fully uncover. But the most important part had already happened. The illusion had been broken, and as I stood there, surrounded by soft lights and distant laughter, I felt something unexpected rise within me. Not fear, not even sadness, but a steady, grounded awareness that whatever came next, I would not look away again. I would not dismiss the signs or soften the truth to make it easier to bear, because for too long, I had accepted a version of my life that was incomplete, and now that I could see the missing pieces, I had no intention of pretending they were not there. The party did not end abruptly. It simply drifted back in emotion the way people do when they are unsure whether they have just witnessed something important or something they should politely ignore, and I found myself stepping slightly away from the center of the room, not to escape, but to observe from a distance that felt more honest, because distance has a way of revealing patterns that closeness often hides. And as I stood near the edge of the living room, watching Daniel speak quietly, with a guest who clearly did not understand why his attention had shifted, my mind began to move backward, not to tonight, but to the months and years that had led us here, and I started to see things I had once dismissed as small inconveniences or harmless misunderstandings, moments that had not seemed worth questioning at the time, like the birthday card that never arrived even though Daniel had mentioned sending something special, or the phone calls that ended abruptly with Vanessa saying they had to run, or the times when I had asked about visiting and been told it was not a good week, not a good month, maybe later, always later, and I had accepted it because I did not want to be a burden, because I believed that love sometimes meant giving space. But now those moments lined up differently in my mind, no longer isolated, no longer random, but connected by something I could not ignore. And I remembered a particular afternoon about a year ago when Daniel had mentioned over the phone that he hoped the extra support was helping me feel more comfortable, and I had smiled into the silence, assuming he meant emotional support, assuming he was speaking in a general way, and I had reassured him that I was doing just fine, that I did not need anything. And now that memory returned with a different weight, because it was no longer a vague comment. It was a direct reference to something real, something that had existed for him, but not for me. And I realized how easily a truth can exist in one person's world while remaining completely invisible in another's, and how dangerous that kind of separation can become when no one stops to question it. And I looked across the room again and saw Vanessa speaking to someone near the kitchen, her posture composed, her expression calm, as if nothing had shifted at all, and I noticed how carefully she chose her movements, how measured her gestures were, as if she understood that control was not about force, but about consistency, about maintaining a version of herself that others would not question, and I felt a quiet understanding settle over me, not of every detail, not yet, but of the shape of what had happened, because whatever path that money had taken, it had not been accidental. It had been directed, managed, handled, and those are not passive actions. They require intention, and I thought about the way she had always positioned herself as the one who organized things, who kept track of details, who made sure everything ran smoothly. And I saw now that what I had once viewed as helpfulness might have also been control, subtle and consistent. And I realized that the story I had been living in was not just incomplete, it had been carefully edited, shaped in a way that kept certain truths out of reach. And as I stood there, listening to the distant hum of conversation and the soft clink of glasses, I felt something inside me settle into place, a kind of steady awareness that did not rush or demand immediate action, but simply existed, clear and undeniable, because the most important shift had already happened. I was no longer guessing, no longer explaining things away. I was seeing, and once you begin to see, you cannot return to not knowing, no matter how comfortable that ignorance once felt. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange kind of politeness, the kind people use when something uncomfortable has been placed in the middle of the room and no one is quite sure who is responsible for moving it. And I noticed how Daniel stayed closer to me than he had in a long time, not hovering, not asking too many questions, but present in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if he were trying to recalibrate his understanding of me in real time. And every so often his eyes would drift back to his phone, his thumb tapping lightly against the screen as if he were retracing steps he had taken months ago, searching for something he might have missed, while Vanessa remained composed, circulating through the room with a careful grace, greeting guests, refilling glasses, maintaining the rhythm of the party as if nothing had shifted at all. And I watched her without staring, noticing the precision in everything she did, the way she smiled at the right moments, the way she listened just long enough before responding, the way she never once returned to the conversation that had just taken place, as if ignoring it would somehow diminish its significance. And I realized then that control is often quiet. It does not demand attention, it redirects it. And for a long time, I had allowed myself to be gently guided away from asking certain questions, not because I was told not to ask them, but because the answers were always just out of reach, wrapped in explanations that felt reasonable at the time. And I thought about the documents I had never seen, the accounts I had never accessed, the decisions that had been made on my behalf without my awareness, and I understood that this had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, layered, built over time in a way that made it difficult to pinpoint a single moment where things changed, because when something shifts slowly, you adjust to it without realizing you are adjusting. And by the time you notice, the distance is already there. And I felt a quiet resolve begin to take shape inside me, not driven by anger or the need for confrontation, but by something steadier, something that came from finally recognizing that I had been standing on uncertain ground for far too long, and that if I wanted clarity, I would have to seek it myself, not wait for it to be offered. And as the evening drew closer to its end, coats being gathered, goodbyes exchanged, I noticed how Daniel approached me again, his expression more serious now, less certain, and he said softly, "Mom, I am going to look into this, I promise." And I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I could see that he meant it, that whatever he had believed before was no longer enough. And when I glanced toward Vanessa, I saw that she was watching us from across the room, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper now, more aware. And in that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between us, not words, not even a clear emotion, but an understanding that whatever had been hidden was no longer entirely under her control. And I turned away first, not out of discomfort, but because I no longer felt the need to hold that gaze, because for the first time in a long time, I was not trying to figure out how to keep the peace. I was simply preparing to understand the truth. And as I stepped out into the cold night air, pulling my coat closer around me, I realized that this night had not ended anything. It had begun something that would not be resolved with a single conversation or a simple explanation, but would require patience, attention, and a willingness to see things exactly as they were, without softening them, without looking away. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt ready to do exactly that. The next morning arrived quietly, the way mornings always do when the night before has shifted something you cannot yet fully name. And I woke before the sun had fully risen, the pale light just beginning to press against the edges of the window. And for a moment I lay still, listening to the familiar sounds of my apartment, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the building settling, and I let myself feel the difference, not in my surroundings, because everything looked exactly the same, but in the way I was seeing it, because once something hidden begins to surface, it changes the way you interpret even the smallest details. And as I sat up and reached for the robe folded neatly at the end of my bed, I realized that this was the first morning in a long time where I was not immediately calculating what needed to be paid, what needed to be stretched, what needed to be postponed, not because those concerns had disappeared, but because they had been joined by something else, something more pressing, the need to understand what had been happening without my knowledge. And I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, making coffee, setting a single cup on the table, and I noticed how quiet the space felt. Not empty, but contained, like a place that had been holding more questions than answers. And I thought about the past 2 years again, but this time I did not stop at the surface memories. I went deeper, recalling conversations more precisely, the exact words Daniel had used, the timing of certain remarks, the way Vanessa had often stepped in to clarify or redirect, and I began to see a pattern not just in what had happened, but in how it had been managed, because there is a difference between something being overlooked and something being consistently guided away from attention, and I could not ignore that difference anymore. And I walked over to the small desk by the window, opening the drawer where I kept my bank statements and documents, papers I had reviewed many times before, but never with this level of scrutiny, and I laid them out carefully, one by one, not expecting to find something obvious, but knowing that clarity often comes from looking again at what you thought you already understood. And as I scanned the numbers, the dates, the balances, I felt a steady calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from focus, because whatever had been happening had left traces, maybe not here, maybe not in these exact papers, but somewhere. And I was no longer willing to accept the absence of answers as something normal, and I reached for my phone, hesitating only briefly before opening my contact list, not to call Daniel, not yet, because I needed to understand more before asking questions that could easily be redirected or softened. But instead I searched for a name I had not contacted in a while, a name that represented something different, something grounded in facts rather than assumptions. And as I stared at the screen for a moment, I realized that this was the first real step, not a confrontation, not an accusation, but a decision to see clearly, to gather information without announcing what I was doing, because there is power in quiet preparation, in understanding the full picture before revealing that you have seen it. And as I set the phone down again, not yet dialing, I looked around my apartment once more, taking in the simplicity of it, the careful order I had maintained, and I felt something shift inside me, not a dramatic change, but a steady strengthening, because for the first time in a very long while, I was not adjusting to circumstances I did not fully understand. I was preparing to uncover them, and I knew, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever I found, it would not be something I could ignore again. By mid-morning, I had already gone through every statement twice, not because I expected the numbers to change, but because repetition has a way of revealing what a single glance might miss. And while nothing in those pages directly explained where the money had gone, they confirmed something just as important, that nothing unusual had ever entered my accounts, no unexplained deposits, no corrections, no delayed transfers, nothing that could be mistaken for $5,000 a month. And that absence, that consistent absence, felt louder than any transaction ever could. And I sat back in my chair, folding my hands loosely in my lap, letting the quiet of the room settle around me as I considered what that meant. Because if the money had been sent and it had not reached me, then it had reached somewhere, and that somewhere was not random. It was chosen, directed, and I thought again about the name I had searched earlier, the one I had not yet called, and this time I did not hesitate. I pressed the number and listened as the line rang, steady and unhurried, until a familiar voice answered, calm and professional, and I introduced myself, explaining that I needed help reviewing some financial details, keeping my tone even, my words simple, because clarity does not require drama. And as I spoke, I could feel the conversation grounding itself in facts rather than assumptions, in processes rather than emotions, and that shift felt important, because, for too long, everything had been based on what I believed or what I had been told, and now I was stepping into something more concrete. And after a brief exchange, an appointment was set for later that afternoon. And when I ended the call, I did not feel relief, not exactly, but I did feel direction, a sense that I was no longer standing still, and I stood up slowly, walking over to the window, watching as people moved along the street below, their lives continuing in ordinary patterns, unaware that anything had changed, and I realized that from the outside, nothing about my life would look different either. The same apartment, the same routines, the same quiet existence. But internally, something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, because once you begin to question the foundation of something, you cannot simply rebuild it on the same assumptions. And I thought about Daniel, about the way his expression had changed the night before, the certainty giving way to confusion, and I knew that he would be searching for answers as well, perhaps calling his bank, reviewing records, asking questions that had never seemed necessary before, and I wondered how long it would take for his path of discovery to intersect with mine, because whatever had been done had involved both of us, even if in very different ways. And then my thoughts turned, briefly but clearly, to Vanessa, not with anger, not yet, but with a kind of measured attention, because understanding someone's actions does not require immediate judgment. It requires observation, and I considered how carefully everything must have been handled, how consistently the story had been maintained, and I understood that this was not something that would unravel on its own. It would require careful attention, the same kind of attention that had allowed it to exist in the first place. And as I prepared to leave for my appointment, gathering my documents and placing them neatly into a folder, I felt a steady resolve settle deeper within me, not loud, not forceful, but present, like a quiet decision that had already been made, because whatever I was about to uncover, it would not change the past, but it would define what came next. And for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer waiting for someone else to explain my life to me. I was preparing to understand it for myself. By the time I reached the bank that afternoon, I could feel the weight of what I was about to do settle more heavily on my shoulders, not because I was afraid of the answers I might find, but because I knew that once this was fully understood, there would be no turning back, no pretending things were the same. And as I sat down in the small, quiet office with the bank representative, I could almost hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second passing with an unspoken promise that something would finally make sense. And when I handed over the documents, I noticed how the woman's expression shifted just slightly, her eyes scanning the papers quickly before returning to me. But there was no judgment, no surprise, just a professional curiosity that mirrored my own. And as she began typing into her computer, I let my gaze wander over the room, the soft hum of the machines, the faint rustling of paper, the quiet sound of the city outside pressing against the glass, and for a moment, everything felt oddly still, as if the world had paused just long enough for this one conversation to unfold. And I realized how often I had let my own world feel smaller, how many things I had allowed to pass without questioning, simply because it was easier that way. But that silence, that stillness, wasn't just external, it was inside me too. A quiet recognition that I had reached a place where I could no longer ignore what I had known all along, that something had been taken, something had been hidden, and it was time to uncover it. After what seemed like an eternity, the woman finally spoke, her voice calm but measured. I've located the transactions. It seems there were multiple transfers made to a different account, but these do not correspond with the account information we have on file for you. And those words, those simple, factual words, carried more weight than I had expected, because they confirmed everything I had suspected. But hearing them spoken out loud, hearing someone else acknowledge it, made it real, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and anger stir inside me. The relief that I was no longer alone in this confusion, and the anger that it had been allowed to happen, without me ever knowing. And as I listened, the woman continued. The account these funds were transferred to is registered under a different name, and it appears to be linked to someone in your family. And those words hit me like a cold splash of water, because I already knew who it was. I didn't need her to say it. I didn't need any more confirmation. But hearing it aloud made something inside me snap into focus. And I sat back in my chair, not because I was shocked, but because now, finally, I had something real to work with, something I could confront, and I felt a steady calm settle over me as I realized that the next steps were mine to take. No longer at the mercy of uncertainty, no longer waiting for someone else to explain. And as the woman finished printing out the transaction records, she slid them across the table toward me, her expression still neutral, but with a subtle hint of understanding. And for a moment, I simply stared at the papers in front of me, knowing that whatever happened next, I was no longer standing on the outside of my own story. I was finally inside it, and I was ready to understand it fully, no matter how difficult that might be. It took a few seconds for the reality of what I had just learned to settle in, the weight of it heavy but somehow clear, and I folded the papers carefully, the crisp edges sliding against each other as I placed them into my bag, not as an act of hiding them, but as a way of carrying them with me, because now they were the evidence I had been missing, the proof that something had been wrong for a long time, something that had been deliberately kept from me. And as I stood up from the chair, I felt the steady pulse of determination begin to rise within me, not driven by a need for revenge or anger, but by a quiet, grounded decision to finally confront the truth, to make sure it could no longer be ignored. And as I left the bank, the world outside felt oddly distant, like it was moving too quickly for me to catch up, but I didn't mind, because for the first time in months, I was no longer trying to keep up with something I didn't understand. I was moving at my own pace. And as I walked down the street, I thought about what I would do next, about how I would speak to Daniel, how I would make sure he understood, and about what I would say to Vanessa, not with accusations, but with facts, because there is power in knowing the truth, and there is power in standing in it. And I knew that whatever happened next, it would not be because I had allowed myself to remain in the dark any longer. And when I arrived home, I stood at the door for a moment, taking a deep breath before I stepped inside. Not out of fear, but out of resolve, because now I had the answers, and now I was ready to face whatever came next, and I knew that it was no longer just about the money. It was about the choices that had been made, the manipulation that had happened, and the trust that had been broken. And as I placed the bag down on the table, I realized that this was the moment everything would change, not because of anything anyone else had done, but because I had chosen to see it, to acknowledge it, to claim it as my own. And in that quiet certainty, I felt a strange peace begin to settle in, not because I had solved everything, but because I had finally allowed myself to start the process of fixing what had been broken. And as I sat down to gather my thoughts, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. And that was exactly what I needed, because sometimes you have to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be, in order to move forward. And I was ready to move forward, no matter where that path would take me.